Alright guys, welcome back. So class 4, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I suppose Tuesday, yeah, in terms of the classes here running from Tuesday to Friday, or Thursday day in terms of our class as well. Class 4 anyway, video 4. We're halfway through Hummingbird, a little bit over halfway. We'll launch back in. We have to get in this video done, Hummingbird, Bavarian Gentians, and I want, as you can see on the board there, I've now changed the board up slightly. There's a past paper question, well I say past paper question, there's a predicted question, or certainly the language within it, and we'll talk about that as well towards the end of this video also, okay? So, third stanza. I believe there were no flowers then in the world where hummingbirds flashed ahead of creation. Again, listen to the language, the immediacy, flashed, creation, big, grandiose terminology. I believe he pierced the slow vegetable veins with his long beak. So in a real bizarre, it's not quite anthropomorphism, we don't want to talk about that, we don't want to bring that in there, but it's definitely metaphorical, this giant hummingbird going around and almost being a huge part of creation, the kind of concept of creationism. The idea also there as well is, we'll look at it at the end, but is Lawrence potentially talking about himself? The next few stanzas here potentially reveal that how difficult it is to create sometimes, which we know in the day school we've spoken about a lot, is very much a very common theme within poets' work, okay? So, the final two stanzas here. Probably he was big as mosses and little lizards, they say, were as mosses and little lizards, they say, were once big. The concept of lizards, dinosaurs, etc., etc. there. Probably he was a jabbing, terrifying monster. So there's a little bit of humour here as well within that second last stanza. Again, the concept of these hummingbirds that at one stage they were massive. And again, the way he goes on here again, that this is the hummingbird almost that is, in terms of like pollination, going around and almost pollinating the world, so to speak. We look at him through the wrong end of the telescope of time, luckily for us. And again, there's that element of humour at the end there. Again, we're looking at him through the wrong telescope of time, because at one stage he was this massive, gargantuan creature moving around the world, and then he says, luckily for us, that now these hummingbirds are small, these kind of vibrant to look at, very rich to look at. Again, that level of activity, frantic behaviour as well, okay? Now, as we discussed, in those final two stanzas there, I think what we're looking at is Lawrence potentially talking about how difficult it is sometimes to create, okay? I think that's very personal, the poem itself. I think it's very much about Lawrence and his ability to create, and about maybe himself at times also, okay? What I would do is that there's a mention when we're talking about this poem is the spontaneity of it all. That is reflected in the structure, in terms of the line lengths, in terms of the changing stanza lengths as well. There's a modernity, is how we would describe it, very much a modern take on that poetry there, which I think is excellent, okay? So I think that's a really, really good poem. And thematically speaking, as we still have on the board here, we are very much talking about life and death in that sense, and creating and creativity as well also. There is no doubt that Hummingbird and Bavarian Gentians are two arguably the more difficult poems to look at. Again, going all the way back, guys, to video 1 that we spoke about, Snake and Mosquito, for example, two poems that are very, very naturalistic. Hummingbird and Bavarian Gentians, very much naturalistic as well. So if it was a case that something like that cropped up in terms of the language of the question, the LOQ, you'll hear me talk about it in this video as well, you could potentially use those two for our nature questions, alright? But Hummingbird, guys, thematically speaking, as discussed, very much about creation, about creating. There is that sense of humour, very much that rejection of poetic language as well. Within that we do get highbrow, we do get very much interesting sensuous language, but again it's very much, it feels like an outpouring from Lawrence on the page and putting across what he wants to put across. It almost feels, because there are so many different tangents within it, it feels representative of the hummingbird moving around constantly, okay? And that's what we're looking at within that poem. Tone, mood, all discussed there as well. And techniques, as we said, feel free to pause, rewind, go back through the techniques, okay? Very interesting tone and mood, reflective, representative of our hummingbird as well, okay? So guys, on to our sixth and final poem in terms of our time spent on Lawrence. We're going to look at page 42 of the notes. Again, if you don't have the notes in front of you, that is our spelling there, Bavarian Gentians. We're talking about flowers within our title, German flowers, a specific classification of flowers. And as discussed, If you have gone through in your own day school, certainly here in the academy we've looked at Boland extensively. We're effectively finished our English course since October of 2019, so everything now just tends to be rehashing over old ground. But what I would say is if you have looked at Boland within your day school and you have looked at the pomegranate, or you've looked at it in the grinds, guys, this is a very, very similar poem in the sense that it's very much about that myth. The Ceres, Persephone, the halls of Dis or Hell, Pluto, Hades, whatever way you want to describe it, that's effectively what we're looking at within this poem, alright? That's the little bit of context. I suppose arguably the most important thing, or one of the most important things to take from this, constructed in 1929, very much at a particular moment in time when Lawrence is very cognizant or very aware of the fact that he is going to die, and he does die then the following year. So written, published 1929, and again death in 1930. Okay, so if we launch in, you can see obviously one of the longer poems on page 42. Again, if you don't have it, quick Google, quick find it on in terms of your poetry notes. But what I would say is one of the longer poems, the Bavarian Gentians for visualization, if we highlight our title straight away, very much dark blue, blue and black flowers, okay? And it's very much allegorical references within this, okay? Very much, as I said, the mythology that's given to us as well, but then there's religious concepts also, okay? So we'll have a little look. An initial couplet, if you don't know what a couplet is, 2-line stanza to start. Not every man has gentians in his house in soft September at slow, sad Michaelmas. So again, that's a religious, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that's effectively a religious festival again in September, okay? So immediately there's the religious connotations bringing in the concept of death, life after death, etc., okay? We get a nice quatrain then, in terms of 2 quatrains actually, our next 4-line stanzas. Again, all just little bits of terminology, guys, that hopefully you can take on board. Bavarian gentians tall and dark, but darkening the daytime torchlight with the smoking blueness of Pluto's gloom. I want us to note the anaphoric element of dark, and then the blue, darkening, darkness. I want us to note that as we go through the poem here, very evidently about death and going into this darkness, okay? Pluto there, again, is our concept of Hades, alright? And this is again linking in with the Greek and Roman mythology about life and death, and as I said, Ceres and Persephone, which we'll get on to now in a second. Ribbed hellish flowers erect, with their blaze of darkness spread blue, blown flat into points by the heavy white draught of the day. I want you to note the contrast. The heavy white draught of the day, whiteness, alive, life, versus the blue-black darkness of death, linking in, as I said, with Pluto there, okay? So a lot of ominous foreshadowing, very heavy language being used here. The Bavarian gentians and their blue-blackness being served or being used to represent the afterlife and certainly darkness of hell and death as well, okay? So, torch flowers of the blue smoking darkness, Pluto's dark blue blaze, black lamps from the halls of Dis. It's the halls of hell, guys. I'll talk about that now in a second. Comes from Dante's Inferno, and we get again, it's linking back into this concept of mythology. Smoking dark blue, giving off darkness, blue darkness as Demeter or Ceres, linking in with Boland's poem. Yellow pale day, whom have you come for here in the white cast day? And we get a question that brings in, anytime you get questions, guys, question marks within poetry, it's to drag the reader in, it's to draw them into the information, okay? Now, the halls of Dis is a particular part of hell. If we're going to go through classical mythology, it's a particular part of hell. It's rings. You often hear the rings of hell. If you guys have seen Inglourious Bastards, when they talk about the ring of hell, for anybody who wastes good scotch, and Michael Fassbender. The idea here, the halls of Dis, were the levels 6 to 9. And very interestingly enough, that was about the blasphemers and the individuals who basically, heretics and individuals who spoke up against God. And I found that's very interesting that a poet would use that particular reference point on his deathbed. Is he effectively renouncing his sins and again going towards God? Very, very interesting significance, Hall of Dis there. You can also take it as a double entendre because Dis is also the name for the ruler of hell as well. It's another one of these names as well. Again, within that third stanza, guys, note the contrast between the yellow day versus the darkness of the afterlife and hell. Okay? Reach me a gentian, give me a torch. So very visual here, as I said, these flowers being representative of the torches, almost lighting the way into hell. The fact that the torch colour is blue as well, very, very significant. Let me guide myself with the blue forked torch of a flower down the darker and darker stairs where blue is darkened on blueness. Down the way Persephone goes. Persephone, again, the pomegranate myth, eating the 6 pomegranate seeds, having to stay in hell for 6 months of the year. Those 6 months are autumn and winter, and then the other 6 months when she's back up on earth becomes spring and summer. That's basically how the ancient Greeks and Romans again talked about the seasons. Just now, in first frosted September, to the sightless realm where darkness is married to dark, and Persephone herself is but a voice as a bride. Again, the fact that Pluto, Hades, then gets Persephone as that bride. It's very interesting that we're dealing with September there, both in our 4th stanza and the 1st stanza. Again, the concept of, as we said, autumn going into winter, the time that Persephone leaves Earth. Okay, to the sightless realm where darkness is married to dark. Again, double, so the connotations of married there, connection to, married to dark, we link in with Hades as well. And Persephone herself is but a voice as a bride, a gloom invisible enfolded in the deeper dark of the arms of Pluto as he ravishes her once again and pierces her once more with his passion of the utter dark among the splendour of blue-black torches, shedding fathomless darkness on the nuptials. Nuptials there, the wedding, the connection between the two. Guys, the ravishing and the piercing element there, there's huge sexual overtones given to us with that. We know from video 1 that Lawrence had written a number of kind of salacious pieces of material, very kind of sexual literature. That concept there of the piercing and the ravishing is that connection between the two. Hades taking Persephone as his bride, and we think about the context of Lawrence on the cusp of death here, and we think about that connection, the connection that's going to be made between the two of them. They are going to be one and of the same here in terms of Lawrence is going to be dead, he's going to be a part of death, so to speak. Okay? The final stanza here, guys. Give me a flower on a tall stem and 3 dark flames, for I will go to the wedding and be a wedding guest at the marriage of the living dark. Now, as I said, that poem is part of that final publication called Last Poems. There is that sense of finality, the sense of closure that is given to us with regards to that poem. That final stanza there is incredibly ominous, foreshadowing, predicting, if you will, Lawrence's own death, and he says that I will be a wedding guest at this wedding, the marriage of Ceres Persephone rather, Ceres is Persephone's mother, Persephone to Hades. He will be a wedding guest. The only chance you get to be a wedding guest at that wedding is if you are in fact dead. So very ominous, foreshadowing, very revealing. It gives us a really strong insight into the mindset and the mind frame of Lawrence at that time. Okay, now, is it surprising that we get poetry call into death, Bavarian gentians? Is it surprising that we get information that is so laden with concepts of death and dying from an individual like Lawrence? No, for a couple of reasons. Because he was very sickly, ultimately dies of tuberculosis at 44, and as we discussed, a wartime poet. Death was around every corner, okay? He lived throughout World War I and travelled then throughout Europe within World War I. He had a German wife. He had to leave England on the back of the fact that he could have potentially been a spy. This is how it was seen. So there's a lot going on in terms of contextually about Lawrence's life, and we see a lot of that within his work as well. Bavarian gentians, guys, as discussed, subject matter wise, very much about death and dying, very heavy, the tone and mood reflective of one another, the repetition, the anaphora of blue, dark, darkness, gives it that feel, gives it that vibe, okay? Amazingly, in terms of video 4 now, we are through our 6 poems. We've kind of cut through a bit of the BS, hopefully. You've kind of taken your 8 to 10 little bits of information, the little kind of one-liners that you may potentially use for each individual poem. And that's where we're at the minute. If I can direct you in the kind of final few moments of this video, the final kind of 4 or 5 minutes, because Lawrence has never come up, as I said, this kind of gives us an idea that there's potential for him to come up this year, okay? As you said, very similar to a poet like Kennelly last year, spent his time on the bench at ordinary level, made it up to the big leagues. Lawrence is the exact same. Now, in light of that, we don't have a past paper question to deal with, and we don't have a past paper question to reference. So what we can do is, on the back of today's work, we can look at the body of his work, the subject matter that he likes to talk about, and then from a stylistic angle, how can we potentially shape and mould the question? And that's what we've come up with here in the department, alright? There are 2 parts to every study poetry question, as discussed. If we have a little read of this question here, guys. So D.H. Lawrence deals with difficult, weighty subject matter within his poetry in a way that is both, at times, accessible and appealing. Make sure the very, very good students will be able to challenge. First off, you'll be able to identify the 2 parts in a question, and then we'll ultimately be able to challenge the language of the question as well, really exploring the different ideas that are contained within it. The additional information that you might get within this question will be something along the lines of, to what extent do you agree or disagree, for example. You'll be way versed in all of that now at this stage, or certainly should be, alright? If we look at the language of the question, this is the LOQ, guys, that you keep hearing me talk about, the language of the question. Lawrence deals with difficult, weighty subject matter. Hashtag 1, that is the first part to this question, and it's asking you about his content. What does he talk about? From today's work, guys, you know, he talks about life and death. We talk about difficult relationships and the passing of his mother. We also talk about, again, difficult relationships behind closed doors, how we're, from societal expectations, expected to behave. That's all difficult, weighty subject matter. It's certainly weighty anyway, okay? Difficult, on the other hand, as I was explaining to my day school students and you guys over the last number of weeks, difficult is twofold there. It's difficult in terms of what he puts across, as in how significant it is, life, death, relationships, etc., etc. But also might potentially be difficult as in, how easy is it to understand his language, his material? So that's just something to think about as we go, okay? Subject matter within his poetry in a way that is both, at times, accessible and appealing. Now, that's our style element, guys. That's the second part of the question. At times, you can challenge, and you can use within your answer and say, yeah, you know what, at times it's very accessible, really, really easy to understand. However, at other times, because we look at the language of the question here, to what extent, well then you challenge that and you say, especially Hummingbird and Bavarian gentians, you know what, at times his poetry was very difficult to access, very difficult to understand. Now, you don't fall on your sword, as I've explained to the grinds over the last while, don't fall on your sword and say, yeah, it was so difficult to understand, I just couldn't get it, the end. You say, initially I found it very difficult, very challenging to get, but then after a second or third reading, you know, that actually the payoff was far greater, because, you know, it took a little bit of work. But having given it, I suppose it's due course, and having given it it's what is required, I ultimately got X, Y, and Z out of it. Don't fall on your sword. Make sure that you say, yeah, at times it was, but however, this is ultimately where I got to, okay? So those are the 2 parts to the question, and that's the element there where we can potentially challenge it. Difficult, weighty subject matter will be this information that we discussed today, will be the subject matter that we discussed, the areas of focus, A, O, F, at the end of each 2 poems, and then stylistically speaking, how accessible was his language, how appealing. Again, remember guys, appealing is it interesting, is it exciting, is it unique, was it, you know, did you gravitate towards it, was it personal to you, etc., etc. Appealing is very, very open-ended, okay? Be sure when we're looking at it to use synonyms of the LOQ, you know, explore your vernacular and your vocabulary. Something we'll have to look at in another video will be that vocab. But, you know, try and show off a little bit. You know, you have to be clever, try and give the terminology that you know, and especially hopefully some of the stuff that you took away from today's class as well, okay? So guys, that might be a nice little essay for you to work on now over the break, now that you consider you have a little bit of time off. Have a little bit to think of the 6 poems that we've looked at today and how we could potentially amalgamate them in to a point-by-point essay on that question. Alright, I hope you found the videos useful, and I hope you're all getting on very, very well, and I'll see you guys soon. Alright, thanks.